Hello, everyone. We'll get started in just a minute as we allow our participants to join virtually. We'll get started in just a minute. Thanks for joining us. I see we still have some people joining us, but I do want to get started today. Good morning or afternoon, wherever you're joining us from. Thank you for tuning in to today's discussion. My name is Rachel Stoll. I'm Vice President of the Stimson Center, as well as the Director of Stimson's Conventional Defense Program, which has been examining the risks and implications of the U.S. drone program for the last 7 years. So I'm really pleased to host this event today, which is going to serve as the launch for our latest analysis and to share the screen with these three incredibly smart colleagues who are each going to provide their unique insights on the challenges and consequences of the United States' now generation-long approach to counterterrorism. And we're going to focus principally on the permissive use of force through lethal airstrikes, which includes drone strikes, of course, but other means as well. So by way of quick introduction to my co-panelists, we have Luke Hartig, who is a fellow in New America's International Security Program, as well as executive director of the National Journal's Network Science Initiative. And Luke previously served as senior director for counterterrorism at the National Security Council during the Obama administration. Next, we have Naz Moderzadeh, who is a professor of practice at Harvard Law School and the founding director of the Harvard Law School program on international law and armed conflict. And last but certainly not least, we're joined by Hina Shamsi, who is the director of the National Security Project at the ACLU. And Luke, Naz, and Hina all participated in an expert group that Stimson convened as part of our examination of the current U.S. drone program and the U.S. government's approach to the use of lethal force more broadly. And their insights, as well as others in the expert group, were really invaluable to our analysis. And I just want to publicly thank them for their time and expertise and acknowledge that they made us seem much smarter than we really are in producing this report. So I'm going to start the conversation today by briefing you all on the report itself, but then get to what you're really here for, which is to hear from these three experts. And we will engage in a conversation so we can delve a little bit deeper into some of the themes and issues raised in the report. But first, I want to show you our video trailer for the report because I've always wanted to do one of these and they're really cool. And it'll just whet your taste buds a little bit for the report itself. So really, there's probably nothing left for me to brief on the report after you've watched the video. But if you've followed Stimson's work on this topic for the last 7 years, you know that we closely examine the legal and strategic questions posed by U.S. drone use outside of war zones, the ways in which U.S. drone use has led to civilian harm, the unique challenges that are posed by global drone proliferation, the difficulties in regulating emergent technologies, and the damaging effects of secrecy on democracy, accountability, and the rule of law. But in this report, for this iteration, we broaden the aperture a bit, and we really reflect on the ways in which the US drone program illustrates or symbolizes the larger assumptions, policies, and actions that have guided decisions to use lethal force in counterterrorism operations around the world for nearly 20 years. And so the report really goes back and reflects on these full 20 years of lethal force and targeted strikes, and summarizes the most recent changes to US policy that guides the use of force in counterterrorism operations. It also outlines ongoing gaps in transparency of that policy. It highlights current trends in the proliferation of drone technology and its use, and it provides 3 country case studies to highlight the human costs and strategic risks of targeted airstrikes in Libya, Somalia, and Yemen. And we're very grateful to our outside authors who contributed to those really meaningful case studies that add a personal touch to the report and talk about demonstrate what we're really talking about in the report. So all of the sort of setup and background sets the stage for a larger discussion about the challenges and insufficiencies that persist within the United States' approach over the last 3 administrations, and tease up a series of recommendations for the Biden administration and for Congress to forge a new agenda. And we do this by discussing 5 key thematic areas, which our experts will all touch on. And those are transparency, accountability and the protection of civilians, international standards and norms, technological development and innovation, and congressional oversight. So I just want to briefly mention sort of the larger issues that we talked about before turning it over to a conversation with the panelists about these issues and why they're particularly important. So if we look at transparency, we know that over the last 20 years, secrecy really continues to hang like a cloud over the US program of lethal airstrikes outside of war zones, which has complicated oversight and accountability for government actions. It potentially has undermined strategic advances, and it's created a dangerous and destabilizing precedent for the use of force. And it's quite shocking. I've said this over the last 7 years, every time we do an event like this, that it's really difficult for us to establish the facts about US targeted airstrikes and assess the legality or strategic efficacy and the impact of US operations. Beyond a few limited efforts, the US government has not adopted a comprehensive or sustained approach to improving transparency over the use of lethal force and counterterrorism writ large. And the failure to do so has really made it impossible for those of us who are trying to analyze strategic value and efficacy to have a good picture of what's happening. If we think about accountability, the US program of conducting lethal airstrikes against people suspected of terrorism and the legal interpretations of supporting it have hindered accountability and really created difficulties and inefficiencies in US government practices for identifying possible instances of civilian harm, as well as responding to and addressing mistakes. And when we think about that, the first US airstrike under this counterterrorism policy was conducted in 2002 in an area outside of active hostilities, and that there's been nearly 1,500 or more than 1,500 drone strikes and other counterterrorism actions in 4 countries, and I'm talking about Libya, Pakistan, Somalia, and Yemen. The American public really does not have a clear accounting of the impact of these strikes. We've seen some tentative steps by the US government to learn more about the impact of these strikes, including mandated reporting, occasional strike justifications. There's even a web page to facilitate outside reporting on civilian casualties, but very little progress has been made to institutionalize accountability. If we look at what all of these things mean towards the development of international standards and norms, and we think about more countries are trying to acquire and use lethal drone capabilities, there are questions of strategic efficacy, legality, transparency, and accountability that are going to continue to magnify concerns about the precedent set by the US approach to using lethal force outside of of active hostilities. And I'm going to leave a lot of that legal conversation to the lawyers on the panel. But I just want to say that the United States is really an outlier in its interpretation of applicable international legal standards. And despite its internationally controversial approach and policies and criticisms from others, US behavior has gone unchanged. And there have been numerous calls by civil society organizations, the United Nations, and others to call for greater international coordination with regards to developing international standards around both export and use of this technology. And there is a need for some forward-looking norms. We do also in the report touch on technological development and innovation because we know that drone technology is going to continue to evolve at a rapid pace, and other technologies are going to be developed that also contribute to these kinds of operations. And so issues related to transparency, accountability, and international precedent are equally relevant to discussions of technology development and innovation, and should be carefully considered by the Biden administration. And then lastly, we don't want to assume or intimate that this is just an issue for the executive branch. Congress has a very clear role to play in both oversight and accountability of US operations abroad. And if in the report we reflect on sort of where Congress has been and evolved in their positions over the last 20 years and the legal frameworks that they have utilized to justify lethal action. And so we argue that there's really a need to reinvigorate Congress's engagement and oversight in the use of lethal force, particularly in order to address some elastic constraints and rein in some of the executive impulses that we've seen in the last 20 years. We've seen lots of discussion in Congress recently about repealing the 2001 and 2002 authorizations for the use of military force. This is a good start, but in the report we go into greater detail. So taking all of this, I know that was really fast, all of this into consideration, the report does offer a series of recommendations for both the Biden administration and for Congress for developing a clear, concise, and constrained strategy that's relevant to the world we're living in today and appropriately situates among other pressing counterterrorism among other pressing security priorities. So in short, what the report argues and what I'm arguing today is that the Biden administration should consider how this post 9/11 US security state has transformed US engagements in the world, reassess the US approach to lethal force, and restore the principles and values that drive US foreign policy. We've seen for the last 20 years policies that are made out of fear, not policies that are made in regard to the rule of law and to rights. And we're looking to see that shift as an entire generation has really been affected by the events 20 years ago. So I'm going to stop there to bring the others into the conversation because I always learn a lot from their insights, and I know our audience will as well. We are really running this part of the event as a conversation. So I want to strongly consider or encourage our audience to consider putting questions directly into the Q&A. I will be monitoring those and introduce them as we discuss the issues with our panel. And we do want this to be, as much as a Zoom webinar can be engaging, we do want to engage with all of you. So, Hannah, Naz, and Luke, let's put this into a little bit of context, which I did very, very quickly, but we've really, in the last 20 years, we've seen the perils of prevention-based policies, which have really focused almost exclusively on anticipation and prevention, with no room, or little room, I should say, for policies focused on resiliency and rights promotion. So we've undertaken these policies for the last 20 years. Why should we change course now? And I'll just open it to the three of you and welcome your insights. I know this group is not shy.
I think we're being polite.
All right, Hannah, I'm going to let you, so you unmuted first. You go.
Well, first of all, let me begin by thanking you, Rachel, and also Shannon for your really wonderful and valuable work on this report. I'm also really psyched not just to be on with Naz and Luke, but to see so many people who are participants who've also been working on these issues for a really long time. And my appreciation goes out to everyone. We'll also say, to paraphrase our friend Dan Mahanti, I think Stimson is second to none in reaching out to and incorporating a variety of views and really ensuring that human rights perspectives are heard. And I very much appreciate that. We'll also say, just with a little caveat, that your recommendations are yours. They're not necessarily all ones that the ACLU has. And also that Rachel is one of the prime experts in the world on arms trade and drone policy. I am not and will not be speaking to those issues. So I think, perils of prevention-based policies, resilience and rights. I mean, you're going really, Rachel, to the heart of what I think of as a counterterrorism-based approach to foreign policy, right? Using a real counterterrorism security-based lens. And I want to begin my part of this discussion by trying to widen the aperture, which I think your report also did. President Biden has said that he wants to end the forever wars. What that means is somewhat contested. It's a really wonderful phrase, one that I certainly champion. But what does it actually mean? He's also said something else very important that I want to bring into the discussion, which is that US national security foreign policy choices have a foreign policy impact as well as a domestic policy impact. And I think it's hard to see this issue without understanding how it has a broader impact, and I'll try and get to that. But stepping back, the use of lethal force, and it used to be targeted killing, things I'm particularly partial to extrajudicial killing because that's really what this program is now a cornerstone of the forever wars that President Biden has pledged to end. It is a policy approach, but also a legal set of contestations that started off as exceptional. When you think about Yemen in 2002 or strikes in the border regions of Pakistan under the Bush administration, further expansion under the Obama administration, these things were all posited as one-offs, exceptional, the kind of thing that the US would have criticized other countries for before 9/11, but then said, we kind of have to do it, though we're not really doing it because it's secret, so we can't acknowledge it. And by the way, we have to work with regimes that may be violating their own government, their own citizens' rights in carrying these out. But what it then grew into, this exceptional thing, is kind of a rule that has a variety of impacts. It violates the separation of powers. So institutional safeguards domestically against the use of lethal force by the executive. It violates international law in many of its particulars. The euphemism outside areas of active hostilities actually applies to outside of recognized armed conflict, where strictly speaking, human rights rules apply. It destabilizes the international regime set up by the international community to safeguard peace and security. And it contributes to destabilization in multiple countries in the world. Yemen is the paradigmatic example of that. And I think most consequently, it has resulted in officially uncounted harm to civilians in majority Muslim, Black, and brown countries. So the global recognition of a need for racial justice around the world with its particular manifestations in particular communities, this is directly implicated here. And I think what this policy has helped to do is contributed to leaving whatever was left of American exceptionalism in tatters. I think that the governments of China and Russia don't need an excuse to violate human rights, including those of their own citizens. But what they shouldn't have is what they have now, which is the ability to cite the United States as an example in setting precedent. And let me sort of, I guess, end with this in terms of thinking about how urgent this issue is. To use the example that began for many of us an epically crappy year last year, right? Which is the strike the Trump administration made against General Soleimani in Iran. And if you'll recall, that strike had shifting justifications, right? They were cherry picking, much as the US has done with respect to legal frameworks, cherry picking from different justifications provided by a variety of administrations, whether relying on imminence, which has virtually lost all meaning with respect to threat, or self-defense, or ultimately a reliance on the 2002 authorization for use of military force, which was never intended for this purpose. But that took us to the brink of something that I think many people hadn't imagined or expected, but nevertheless was a logical outcome of US legal positions and policy positions, because the Trump administration was yet again exceptional in that way, but unfortunately didn't have to go so far. And people remember that in our community that works on this set of issues. I'd like to also bring in the domestic impact, because many of us work on those issues as well, which is that Iranian Americans, people of Iranian heritage, were then harassed, detained, questioned at the border, treated like second-class citizens in a pattern that often happens after lethal strikes that take place abroad, asked for their views on strikes. And so that implicated their rights, right? It had a domestic impact. And we see that over and over again. And so part of what I would argue is that when we think about strategy and what the consequences are, we've got to start out looking at that whole.
Thanks, Hina. Luke, I'm going to turn to you and then Naz.
Great. Well, I want to really echo what Hina was saying at the outset about the incredible work that Rachel and Shannon have put into this report. With the same caveat that I don't necessarily agree with every single thing in here. I think we all agree, everybody who participated in this, and I certainly don't agree on everything with Hina and Naz as well. But I think we all agree that Rachel is about as fair-minded as it gets, and will present everything in good faith, and still won't shy away from putting down on paper what she thinks is the right thing to do. So I think just the utmost respect for the work you've done here. I actually first encountered this work back in, I think at the very beginning, when you're working with General Abizaid and Rosa Brooks and a couple others on this. And I was still in government at the time, and since I've had the chance to kind of work on this from the outside, and really a pleasure to be part of this. I want to maybe start with that picking up kind of on that last question you put out, which is sort of the perils of prevention-based policies. And look, I've been on the policymaker side of this, and the imperative at the White House level, at the Pentagon level, when you see a clear threat to U.S. persons and there's an ability to do something about it, is the kind of thing that I think any policymaker is going to feel the urge to act on that. But I think we're not always talking about just those situations, right? When we look at the volume of strikes over the last several years, I think it raises a lot of questions as to, are we still always saying this is the sort of thing we only do when this is the last resort to prevent an imminent attack? And I'm not sure that we're always getting to that point. I think there's a few things that Rachel, you sort of teased out and that Hina brought up as well that are worth kind of engaging on. And this first question of resilience, should we be thinking about resilience as a way of maybe saying that we don't have to try to stop every single effort from anybody in the world who wants to harm American citizens, which is certainly an innumerable number of those things. And when you're in government, you kind of are bombarded every day by those threats. And I think the unfortunate reality has been for the better part of the last 20 years, we've been in this kind of crazy political and news cycle where every single terrorist threat is hyped to a very high level. And I think it's hard for senior policymakers to sort of encourage a culture of resilience when there's such a fear-based approach to talking about terrorism. I think you've begun to see some shifts in that thinking. Certainly President Obama talked about making some shifts and kind of putting terrorism in perspective. I think even things like the COVID-19 pandemic has served to put the risks of terrorism into some level of perspective compared to other risks that we face. And certainly the focus on climate kind of brings that to bear as well. So there's a little bit of work that needs to be done, not a little bit, a lot of work actually needs to be done from our political leaders, from the media, from others to sort of put terrorism in context. And that's not to say that we shouldn't be taking appropriate action against those who could pose significant threats to the United States, but that's not everybody that's out there. The second thing I would say is that we are not in a, September 10th, 2001 space anymore, right? Since 9/11, we have built just massive amounts of defensive capabilities. And I know that many of my colleagues would point out some of the challenges with those capabilities and some of the things that we'd rather reform in that space. But it's no doubt that we built pretty effective defenses. And yet there's still oftentimes kind of a perspective that if we're not out proactively going after every single threat, it's going to result in a major attack on the homeland. And it's like in the world of foreign policy, it often feels like, it's not okay to say we should play defense. But I think there's some times when we should say maybe we should play some defense. Maybe we should be willing to accept some risk and accept that the incredible amount of emphasis we put into law enforcement, into border security, into other mechanisms like that may actually prevent an attack from happening. I mean, heck, even just spending a couple $1,000s to put an armored cockpit door would have prevented the 9/11 attacks as well. And then I think another piece that came up here is this question around, do we have a CT-centric approach to foreign policy? It is the organizing principle of foreign policy. And I think, unfortunately, for too long, that the answer has been yes. And there have been good reasons for that. There have been not so good reasons for that. I think we're finally starting to see a shift on that, again, because of things like COVID, because of things like climate change, because of the rise of Russia as a nefarious actor and of China just in its increasing power. You're seeing a shift in conversation in the foreign policy space where CT is not the organizing principle. The next step on that is to make sure that we are actually developing holistic approaches to CT, that we are investing in the types of preventative capabilities that our foreign policy apparatus needs, that we're embracing the fragility agenda and figuring out how do we address the underlying drivers of terrorism and instability in a more holistic way, that we're investing in the civilian tools that allow us to actually do that. And then we're running a process, not to get too wonky on this, but a process where we're bringing in that range of diverse voices to think about what are the ways that we can address terrorism and other irregular threats without having to rely on drones as our way of doing that. So lots more to explore, but there's just a couple initial reactions to your point about prevention-based policies.
Naz, I'll turn it to you.
Thanks so much. At the risk of being repetitive, I really wanted to echo the appreciation, Rachel, for your work and Shannon's work on this. And of course, to echo, I also don't share all the recommendations, but I really appreciate that we're able to have a conversation amongst those who we've all been working on these issues, I think for close to 20 years, many of us together, and also to hear perspectives from those like Luke who have experience with policymaking from within government, and those like Hina who have led the way in calling for accountability and transparency for many, many years in this ongoing conflict. So in the spirit of staying within my lane, as Hina suggested for herself, I think I'll kind of keep my comments to some of the remarks you made and some of the recommendations in the report regarding the legal framework, and particularly the implications of the indefinite wars, the forever wars, whatever nomenclature we choose to utilize for international law and constraints that international law imposes on the use of force. And if you'll allow me, I've been thinking a lot this year, and particularly since the announcement of the withdrawal from Afghanistan, about the final year of the Vietnam War. And I've been thinking about sort of what it means when a country, a public, the military thinks about and takes account of a long war and of the possibilities of failure and the implications of failure in some of those cases. So if it's okay, I thought I'd read a quote from an international law scholar writing about the intervention in Cambodia. And of course, as we all may remember, there was a decision in 1970, initially secretly and not transparently, to invade Cambodia and to engage in extensive bombardment in Cambodia on the basis of the argument that Cambodia was providing sanctuary for North Vietnamese forces, and that therefore the United States had the right to use force against Cambodian territory, not against the Cambodian government, but rather against forces that were on Cambodia's territory, a precursor in many ways to the legal argument that we hear today, rationalizing and legitimizing the use of force in so-called areas outside of active hostilities. So the scholar says, writing in 1972, the development of international law is very much a consequence of the effective assertion of claims by principal states. Such claims create legal precedents that can be relied upon on subsequent occasions by other states. The Cambodian operation, in this sense, represents both a violation of existing procedural and substantive rules of international law and a very unfortunate legislative claim for the future. It will now be possible for states to rely on the Cambodian operation in carrying out raids against external base areas, or even when invading a foreign country allegedly being used as a sanctuary. It will no longer be possible for the United States government to make credible objections to these claims. The consequences of such a precedent for the Middle East and Africa seem to be highly destabilizing. In essence, then, the Cambodian operation represents a step backward in the struggle to impose restraints on the use of force in the conduct of foreign relations. And I think these words resonate today. And I think there is a really important aspect to this report and the recommendations that says, while of course we need to think about changing particular policies, while of course we need to think about who is responsible for strikes or whose authority they are under, I think the really central point is it is no longer good enough to rely on experts, lawyers, executive branch actors in the United States government to say, trust us, we are holding ourselves accountable. Trust us, we are interpreting international law appropriately. And to underscore that until and unless we take seriously that these interventions are violations of the law on the use of force, meaning they are unlawful uses of military force on the territory of other states, that we will not be ending forever wars. As admirable as it may be to draw down uses of force in particular places, I think it's really important to understand that as long as the legal logic remains, as long as this counterterrorism-based approach to the use of force remains a viable one on the shelf, as it were, for the next administration to pick up, we will not be addressing the root cause of many of the tragic consequences that we discuss in this report and that many that are participating here have been documenting and discussing for years. Thanks.
Thanks to all three of you. And I'm really humbled by your very, very kind words to Shannon, Dick, and I, who spent a year working on this report and with all of you. And it really is an incredible validation for that work that not only are you pleased to have been part of it, but that you have such kind words to say. And I should have said at the outset that this is Stimson's report. So while we were informed by the advice of many experts, and I'm looking in the participants list and I see many of them are here today and they're listed in the report, and and some of our contributors for our case studies are here as well. And I'm very appreciative for that. The recommendations are Stimson's alone. And I also feel like we've done our job, if not everyone agrees with all of them, because it means we've really covered the range of issues and perspectives that for us really represent a common sense approach to handling these issues. So thank you for that. In our report, and I want to come back to this notion of forever war, so I will be back to it, because particularly in light of the president's speech last night to Congress and his use of that word in the singular. But I really want to think about, in the report, we talk about how the Biden administration can reconstruct the US approach to counterterrorism and ensure that policies are more restrained, they're more sustainable, that they better align with US commitments to transparency, accountability, and the protection of human rights. So for all of you, what does transparency and accountability mean in this context? What does it look like? What have we done to date? We've all sort of said, it's a little bit insufficient in these ways, and that we haven't had institutionalized accountability. So what is the importance of that? What does it look like? Sort of historically reflecting back. What I like about this report in particular is that we not only reflect back over 20 years, but then we sort of push forward for those 20 years. So you have the freedom in your remarks to look backwards, forwards, whatever is appropriate. Maybe we'll go in reverse order this time. So I'll start with you, Naz.
Sorry, I was trying to be high tech and answer a question live in the Q&A and doing too many things at once. So yeah, I think on transparency and accountability, I think it's probably my job to say that international law and law in general doesn't necessarily help us so much here. So I think it's important to say that you can run and execute multiple secret wars and still comply with international law, particularly international humanitarian law. So I think the key here, and I think the report does a great job of doing this, is to recognize that that is the job of politics. That is the job of all of us who play a role in our political system to insist upon accountability and transparency. And in the US's political system, that may well be through other branches of government. So I think here, the key is that we need to, I think, emphasize that transparency is critical for the public, that we think that it is important, or I think it is important, I should say, that people know what countries their nation is at war with or in. And that in order to achieve that, we need to call upon our political representatives, we need to call upon Congress in order to become involved in insisting that these decisions are made public and that the underlying legal rationales are also made public and discussed publicly.
Luke, I'll turn it to you.
Yeah, no, it's a great question. I think first I would just start by saying that, actually kind of unraveling or getting to transparency within government is a tough thing. And I think there are good faith reasons for that, right? I mean, we have the people and the professionals who work on these programs who've been, are great patriots, have done great work since 9/11. And even before that, for many, there's a level of secrecy ingrained in the culture. Right. And a lot of that's good, especially you want the special operations community, for example, to prize secrecy. It's essential for operational security. And so, but what it requires is kind of a concerted push from the top of the institution. And that can be civilian leadership. That can also be military leadership. I'm looking at some of the things that AFRICOM has done to try to advance transparency kind of beyond what the Trump administration asked them to do. And that kind of pressure has to remain for this to happen. You have to question some of the assertions that come up. So, if we were to reveal the legal framework we use, if we were to disclose the presidential policy guidance that guided drone strikes during the Obama administration, that these would essentially be giving away our playbook to the enemy, and that they would be able to avoid being struck and such. I just think a lot of those things didn't bear out. That didn't bear out to be totally true. A lot of those were overstated, and so you have to listen to the professionals, but you also have to question the assumptions and figure out how do we balance the appropriate need for secrecy with the need, as Naz expressed so eloquently, for the American public, for democratic institutions to have that kind of transparency that they need. So where are we at? Well, the Obama administration's made some decent strides. They were slow. They were a lot slower, I think, than other folks on this call would have liked, but made some strides for transparency, right? They talked about the legal framework. They eventually released the PPG after being sued to have the PPG released, but eventually released the presidential policy guidance. They released a pretty remarkable document in the final month or so of the Obama administration, laying out an extensive documentation of the legal and policy justifications for the war on terror. And that was very useful. And they got to a point of releasing on a regular basis strikes in Yemen, strikes in Somalia, discussing what happened to those strikes, the results of those strikes, et cetera. Much of that kind of disappeared in the Trump administration, at least when it came to kind of like the legal and policy framework. So the Trump administration reportedly put out a new guidance document called the Principal Standards and Procedures Governing Drone Strikes. That document was never released. They never even acknowledged putting it out. It was only came out in like a New York Times or Washington Post report that document had even been approved. There was, of course, a move away from some of the congressional reporting requirements, public reporting requirements about the number of strikes, number of civilian casualties over the course of the previous year that the Trump administration just didn't get into. And there are other things like that where they just kind of thumb their nose at the idea of transparency as a virtue. And yet during that time, you continue to see U.S. Central Command to some extent and U.S. Africa Command to a greater extent, pursue some level of transparency around their operations. And yet there's still a lot of work to be done. And this is where I think it gets to be really tricky, which is oftentimes in the cases where I think the greatest level of transparency would be helpful is when the US military, US government assesses a different set of results from an operation than the assessments put forward by credible third-party groups like Amnesty International or others. In Somalia, for example, Amnesty has done some really great work documenting civilian casualties. They're very transparent about their methodology, how they do it. They acknowledge that they're not able to actually travel to villages where strikes took place, but they acknowledge how they built a network to be able to do interviews and assess what actually happened. And the U.S. military has not been as transparent in describing how it gets to its assessments or explaining why it agrees with or disagrees with certain things put forward by Amnesty. So, there's a lot of additional work that needs to be done in that space. And it's hard because a lot of how the US military makes its assessments of civilian casualties are based on things like classified signals intelligence or human intelligence, other things like that are these kind of classified sources and methods that they just can't get into. At the same time, that can't be an excuse to sort of hide behind those sources and methods and not actually get to the level of dialogue around what's happening and why they might reach a different conclusion than the human rights community. So I don't mean to say that part's easy at all. I think this is a hard part, but I think it's worthy work to start to explore how we can reach some of those differences in methodologies and different approaches and results around civilian casualties.
Thanks, Hannah.
Thank you. So I guess I start with the premise that secretive and unaccountable killing should be unacceptable in a democracy. And yet this is what we have with respect to this program. And Naz is, of course, absolutely right with respect to what the laws of war do or don't require. But this is where the cherry picking part comes in, right? This is a program that does not apply in areas where there is recognized armed conflict, where a arguably more, a different set of rules applies. This is an area where human rights law, which unfortunately the US doesn't recognize as, the US recognizes it, but more in the form of lip service in this context than abiding by it. That's really where the transparency and accountability requirements may come from, although I would also argue that there are policy reasons for governments moving to provide transparency in the armed conflict context, but put that aside for now. So here what we have is, in essence, a claim of secret law that has lasted for a number of years. The transparency that Luke was talking about required lawsuits by the ACLU and the New York Times in order to force disclosure. We are still trying to force disclosure of the Trump administration's changes to the rules. And hopefully the Biden administration will do the right thing. But it really shouldn't take litigation for our government to release its lethal force rules for the use of force abroad. And the part of the problem here is that transparency on its own is not enough. Transparency and accountability have to go hand in hand. And here I go back to what Naz started out with, which is that fundamental recognition that what we're talking about is not consistent with the law. In fact, it doesn't abide by the law, right? And so that has been hard to get. And where, Luke, I completely, appreciate your reference to what the Obama administration did. But I remember at the end of the Obama administration, when it was clear that President Trump had been elected, essentially sort of beseeching, rein in what you have claimed, because whatever you all may have thought was trustworthy is about to go. I won't use the words that I thought of at the time. And that's not what the Obama administration did. Whether out of some kind of, I don't know what it was, but they instead released that report, perhaps to try and put constraints on the executive branch going forward, right? These were the policy constraints that we put in place. And what that essentially did was further entrenched claims by a Democratic administration for the use of secretive and unaccountable lethal force that Trump then blew right through. And so for me, I think that, if I may, transparency feels very 2000s. We're now in 2021, and we should not be arguing about the minimal, we're going to pursue our lawsuits, but really from a policy perspective, this is not where the debate should be. And where it should be is, what are the ways of providing accountability, assessing this, right? So Luke, you rightly referred to the really amazing work that Amnesty colleagues have been doing in Somalia. And they join, HRW, elsewhere, Reprieve, let alone multiple sort of organizations trying to provide media transparency in the face of failures by the executive branch. But we keep seeing over and over again that the kinds of claims made by people who are subjected to the receiving end of US lethal power not really taken into account, right? And so I think, again, coming back to a narrow legal question about transparency doesn't get at where this program and its destabilizing effect goes to the heart of institutions, lives, and rights.
Thanks. All three of you really touched on, transparency is great. I don't want to undermine transparency either, but it's not transparency for transparency's sake. It's transparency to an end, right? And all three of you mentioned civilian harm and civilian harm mitigation as sort of central to that discussion. And there's quite a few questions in the chat. I want to talk about sort of, and the report goes into civilian harm quite a bit, and civilian harm mitigation efforts that the US has undertaken in the past, and then provide some recommendations, of course, for the future. And I appreciate our old friend Charlie Dunlap has put some comments about civilian harm in the Q&A. And I do think that there is sort of a tension that he references in his question about the military shying away from asserting numbers of casualties, in part because of the difficulty. And we've just talked about, Luke mentioned the difficulty in getting into particular areas and relying on networks to gather that information. But it's also sort of the negative history that we associate. Naz referenced the Vietnam War and the attacks in Cambodia at the beginning, but there does sort of end up being, in some cases, a fear of distortion of those numbers and how those numbers are used. The reality is, we know the United States has contributed to significant civilian harm. We talk about, there are 3 cases in the report where we look at the impact of US strikes. And so I just want to focus our conversation a little bit on this notion of civilian harm, both mitigation in the past, but also potential opportunities in the future. Maybe this time I'll start with Luke and then go, I'm gonna like shake it up every time. Luke, and then go to Naz and then Hina.
Yeah, I mean, and thanks, Charlie, for chiming in on this. Charlie and I have had a number of really great exchanges, and I've learned a lot, and I hope he has as well. We don't always agree, but I appreciate the dialogue immensely on this. I think part of what Charlie's getting at, I think that's the crux of some of the disagreement we've had around this, on kind of this body count issue and such, is that a straight accounting of, in the last year around the world, or even in these theaters, this was the number of strikes that were taken, this was the number of combatants that the United States assesses were killed, and this is the number of civilians they assess were killed, doesn't tell you much in and of itself, right? And it does feel like just a pure numbers exercise, and we don't want to reduce it to that, right? Because we're talking about actual human death, and we need to be able to address what that entails. And I think where I come down on this is that transparency is important, but it's insufficient, right? You need to be able to have a greater dialogue around why are we even conducting strikes in Somalia, which is a question I've asked a lot over the last year, right? And we had a record year of strikes in Somalia, as we noted. Amnesty has documented a number of those that were problematic. There's kind of some shifting questions around which strikes were taken against high-value terrorists versus strikes that were taken in collective self-defense, which is sort of a concept that I think a lot of people weren't even aware of until a couple of years ago. And so there needs to be that kind of dialogue of, why are we even doing this? What is the larger sense of harm that we are trying to prevent, whether that's to the United States, whether that's to the Somali people, whether that's in support of the building up the Somali government? Those are really important contextual pieces, and I think it's really hard to fully assess civilian casualties and combatant casualties, for that matter, and the significance of them without putting it in that broader context. So I would hope to see more of that. When it comes to transparency. And one of the points that Hina brought up that I think is a really great point, and I totally agree. I think any investigation that doesn't involve some interview with witnesses feels to me like an incomplete investigation. And so, maybe this is part of transparency. Maybe this is, as Hina said, moving beyond the 2000s transparency conversation and thinking forward to, like, let's actually get under the hood a little bit more and say, what are we doing here to, assess the level of civilian harm in the first place? And are there best practices that we can agree on that would dramatically improve our ability to assess what actually occurred, and ultimately to prevent those things? I will say that I think there's been, having first gotten involved with the drone program back in 2010 or so, the level of learning in the US military has been tremendous. And that is carried on even through the Trump administration, when they didn't prioritize some of these concepts we're talking about today. And ultimately, that learning only begins when there's like a thorough accounting of what's actually happened and drawing out some lessons learned from that.
Great, Naz. And there's a question, I'm just going to throw this out as well. And I apologize, I didn't realize that the audience couldn't see the question. So there's a question that says, the report calls for the establishment of an effective claim system for civilians to request acknowledgement and possibly compensation for loss if they so choose. And given the annual $3 million appropriation for the same, is there any defensible reason for the military not to establish such a system? So perhaps Naz or Hina, you could sort of talk about what that might look like as well.
Yeah, thanks. I'll leave that good question to Hina, and just 2 comments building on what Luke said. And I think one of the points from Charlie in his question raises a really important issue, and that is, once you have this kind of secret killing or authorization for secret killing, it becomes very tempting to continue to use it for different reasons. So Charlie, for example, raises the possibility that there could well be arguments that say, shouldn't we use targeted killings or strikes outside of armed conflict to protect people, right? What if there are communities that are in danger or their rights are being violated, and there was an assessment that said if there were some limited strikes to take out those who are posing those threats, that would actually be better for the people who are under threat. There's also, of course, the possibility that we have an official end to the armed conflict in Afghanistan, but then the continuation of limited strikes or special forces utilization for strikes for particular kinds of targets. And I think it's important to recognize that no matter how seriously the United States Armed Forces take civilian casualties, and my view in working closely for many years with many members of the armed forces is they do take it incredibly seriously, there will be civilian casualties and deaths for as long as there is a military use of force. So I think that this is that hard moment where you have to recognize that if we want to end the use of lethal force in this manner, if we want to end the expansion of the idea of war to many, many countries all over the globe, then we also are ending the ability to use this tool whenever a particular administration sees fit, even if the reasons seem very noble and just at the time. I think it's a recognition that if the idea is that we want to diminish civilian casualties, the pressure is not on the military, I think, to be better about minimizing civilian casualties. That's, of course, always important and legally obligatory, but it's far more important, I think, to recognize that it's the approval of the use of force in the first place that is the critical piece that we need to address.
I always like agreeing with Naz. And hi, Charlie. Charlie and I have tussled a lot about things over the years, and I've always admired his passion. Charlie, you know, I guess I want to go back to where Naz left off, which is we can certainly talk about, and there are many others on this call as well, who have tremendous expertise in civilian harm reduction, right? And that can be a conversation, happy to have it. And in response to Dan, absolutely, right? There are appropriated funds to set up compensation for victims. Haven't been used as far as we know, haven't been disseminated. Again, we're 16 years into this program and we can't figure out transparency and accountability. Like, is that really where we should be starting out? I mean, this is now a leadership, strategic and policy question. And getting into continuing down the path of discussion where we're within the parameters of lethal force being the only or primary option, I think kind of misses the point, because we're not actually going back to the resilience point, right? We're not actually thinking about the other ways in which you can address security. And there's a ongoing discussion about national versus human security. I'd argue it's human security, because we're talking about people in countries where we are launching drones and airstrikes. And that requires an emphasis and elevation of humanitarian, diplomatic, and other tools in order to address both real and perceived threats. I keep being haunted. There's Shannon and Rachel have, really important inputs from colleagues on case studies in Libya, which was just another massive expansion based on technicalities of, availability of lethal force as an option, and other sort of case studies in particular countries. But in the interim, while Rachel and Shannon, you were finalizing this report, colleague organization, Watana for Human Rights, released a really valuable report back in March of this year. And they raised a whole series of strikes that had taken place in Yemen, majority under Obama, and massive civilian harms that resulted. And part of what I thought was so useful about the report is that it points out the ways in which these strikes have an impact on people who are amongst the poorest of the poor, right? Beyond the immediate impact on people and families. And there's one quote that continues to haunt me. It's the brother of a man who was killed in a September 2012 strike that resulted in deaths virtually entirely of civilians, according to our Watana colleagues. And he said, "We had hoped that America would come to the region with educational and development projects and services, but it came instead with aircrafts to kill our children." Now, if we're widening our aperture, as I think we should, beyond threat perception, military arguments about precision, to what really should be strategic planning and strategic thinking 101, which is why, to what end, with what impacts, immediate, long-term, and institutionally and broadly, then I think that's kind of a place to start.
Thanks all three of you, because I think we do sort of lose sight on what is at stake. And I was looking at the president's speech again from last night, and there are quite a few questions. So I apologize to those who've asked them, because I'm going to sort of mush them together, about the end of the forever war. And that's what the president said last night about ending the war in Afghanistan and bringing US servicemen and women home. And I think the use of the singular, like there's only one forever war, is quite misleading, right? As we've just spent the last hour talking about, there has been an expansion of these undertakings. There has been what was once exceptional has become more common. And so it really is forever wars. And I do think that all of us, as we're watching the rhetoric, have thought about the potential risk that the administration will retain the current approach to counterterrorism. And there are questions here about, if we pull out and leave Afghanistan, but we say, well, we'll still be able to conduct strikes, presumably with unmanned aircraft, from other locations. Or when we think about what's happening in Somalia, and we have the case study in Somalia, all of these places, we may physically remove troops from those locations, but if the policy, if the strategy, if the approach doesn't change, then we're really not diminishing the number of strikes. We're just diminishing the number of people in the locations where U.S. people where we are conducting those strikes. So I guess a lot of the questions are looking at how do we not stumble into a broader expansion of these kinds of strikes and really get to the heart of what we're all talking about, which is constraining or restraining sort of that executive reach. And I know this is something we struggled with a lot in the expert group as we talked about this, but I think it's a really important question, particularly given sort of the acceptance of the president's remarks and the sort of embracing of this new order. So I think I started with Luke last time. So I'm going to go back to starting with Hina, because I think you've gone last twice.
Thank you. Yeah, so I think that the approach of still continuing to invoke or rely on the ability to engage in so-called counterterrorism strikes, that is both a heading straight into repeating mistakes, because that's how this entire set of programs started. And it's also, I would argue, a missed opportunity, because if we go down a path where there is withdrawal, no troops on the ground in Afghanistan at the very least, then a few different things happen, right? And they have longer lasting consequences. And I just want to go in this direction a little bit, which is the ability to maintain and argue as a strategic or legal option to engage in so-called counterterrorism strikes would really take the US further down a path of extreme legal positions with respect to law and the ability to kill without constraints. With an end to troops in Afghanistan and an end to the armed conflict there, even the most tenuous arguments about the availability of the 2001 AUMF fall away, right? Which means, and this has been our position for years, that use of lethal force outside of the recognized armed conflict that was authorized in a limited way under the 2000 AUMF, not lawful. Congress hasn't authorized it. International law doesn't allow it. Without those, what is left, right? And then that goes into a question about what framework. And really, if there is no framework, then what you're landing in kind of is where the Trump administration was, with a set of very extreme arguments, and not a good thing. It also continues to place an emphasis on the militarized approach to foreign policy, which is one of the root causes of a failed approach here, right? And the mistake from the past is, and it bears repeating, this is how the strikes started in Pakistan. This is how they started in Yemen. This is how they started in Somalia, where, forces may be withdrawing, but the ability to carry out strikes from a base in Djibouti still potentially continues. And rather than committing to that path immediately, I think the administration needs to really slow down and think through before it commits itself to these kinds of positions. And I think it's also a missed opportunity. We are, I see really respected foreign policy, civil society folks in government trying to set a new and better path. They are trying to take into account that the challenges we face now include global pandemic, climate change, multiple other things. To do that requires steering the bureaucratic ship in a different direction. The bureaucratic ship will always want to revert to a place of least resistance, which is, here's what we've known for 20 years. We've been able to kind of get away with it. There's been criticism, so forth. This is probably not where we want to be going in the next 20 years, which is to claim the ability to carry out lethal force secretively, or even not so secretively, without accountability, in straight out violation of both international law and without Congress weighing in. And just one more thing on Congress weighing in. I will be first to admit that in many ways, Congress has been feckless in these areas, and that the separation of powers and it's sort of the robust things that we need from separation of powers haven't been in place. But that's why what we actually need is war powers reform, right? To take away from the incentives of hands off, we don't want to be politically responsible, from Congress, to actually constraining the executive and ensuring that Congress has a role to play legitimately. But in the meantime, you don't need Congress to end unlawful uses of claims of lethal force.
Great, Naz.
Yeah, thanks. I think you're absolutely right, Rachel, to point out first and foremost that, of course, ending the conflict in Afghanistan and talking about this in the singular is not only, I think, factually incorrect, but also discursively, if you will, kind of allows for the idea that there is one war, one counterterrorism war against a group in all of these different places. And I think says so many years in, the idea that we would even be able to continue to speak in that manner, to treat people in Somalia like they are in some way the same as people in Yemen or people in Afghanistan or people in Niger is, there are a lot of colorful adjectives one could use, but it fundamentally not only incorrect, but deeply, deeply offensive. So I think that's one, is it's plural, and it's plural because these are multiple wars in multiple places. Second, I think that there is something about the idea. So there are a lot of fancy legal arguments about what we're talking about, but fundamentally, we are talking about an argument that says when there are people who pose a threat to the United States and its allies, and those people are in some tenuous manner associated with a group 20 years ago that engaged in the strikes of 9/11. Those people are in a war against the United States and can, under certain circumstances, at the discretion of the United States, be killed. I think that it's important to recognize, and Charlie is raising in the chat, the idea of doesn't the enemy get the vote, or in essence, kind of what about the fact that there are still risks out there? I think it's really important to recognize that if this justification is reversed, if this kind of force is brought to an end and determined to be both illegal and not a good idea, there will be some cases of greater risk. And part of the conversation with the American public and with publics more broadly is about the fact that, of course, stepping back from engagement in lethal force abroad can have consequences that are very difficult to predict as we all sit here today, for the people in those places and for the people in the United States. And I think, again, when we talk about doing the work of the politics of this, that is part of the conversation, is how do we talk honestly about the kinds of risks that we face, and how do we talk honestly about what kinds of risks the public is willing to accept in order to not be engaged in armed conflicts all over the world.
Thanks, Luke.
I mean, I love this question because I think it gets to the crux of it, right? I mean, it's not necessarily about drone policy; it's about the broader campaign. I think the first thing I would say is that I think it's actually even broader than that, right? We have a overwhelming proclivity, definitely since the end of the Cold War, probably even before that, to engage in just a broad range of irregular warfare type engagements, right? If you look at the Obama administration, there's the Libya war, which I would argue was not even really an irregular warfare. That was just kind of full-on war, but it wasn't something that was authorized by Congress by any means. And we sent, dozens of Green Berets to Uganda to chase Joseph Kony around and try to capture him. And again, there were different reasons for that, but still a pretty kind of militarized approach to the threat that he posed. Even President Trump, who talked about ending the forever wars and kind of made this bringing the troops home part of what he said he was about, and we can argue about that at various points. But he launched cruise missiles into Syria in response to chemical weapons use. He killed Soleimani, which wasn't a CT thing at all, and ratcheted up efforts against Iranian proxies all over. So these come back, and there's an overwhelming tendency for us to try to engage in a range of irregular warfare type engagements, even if it's not CT. And so I do think we have to think about a framework that's a bit broader than purely constraining the CT space. As to what ending the forever wars actually looks like, I'm not somebody who believes that we'll get to a point where we're just not conducting any military operations against terrorist groups anywhere. I think there will always be, maybe not always, hopefully not always, but at least for the near and medium term, some role for use of force for military to address the terrorist threats that we face. What I worry about, though, is that we've had where we're at now is not kind of a last resort type place. It's a much more expansive conflict, and so I think ending the forever wars means dramatically reining in what we have going on. And I think there's a few big things that the administration could do to get there. Certainly one of the big things, and maybe this is a little bit of a blinding flash of the obvious, but they should actually be contracting the war, not expanding it, right? And I think the move in Afghanistan is a good move in that direction. Certainly they've emphasized that there could still be over the horizon options, but all of that gets harder when you don't have a substantial presence in country. I've been troubled to watch what's happening in Mozambique, and that we're sending Green Beret advisors there to support that campaign under the what seems to me pretty dubious assessment that somehow there's an ISIS connection there. I think those are the sorts of things that we should be casting a very careful eye on. I think more broadly, if you look at where our forces are postured around the world, we have tons of terrorism task forces. We have a drone base apparently in the Sahel. We at some point, I think, had 600 or 700 troops in Somalia. You start to look at this and say, there's this kind of global architecture and posture that we need to address and figure out, to what extent is there, when there's a task force and forces in an area, are they going to find a mission to take on, as opposed to the opposite, where we should be sending forces where we think there's a real reason and real national security imperative to engage. When we do use force, it has to absolutely be a last resort, and it has to be constrained by a very careful framework. That's not just let's dust off the 2013 PPG. That's thinking through what a new framework might look like, and it's one that emphasizes, again, alternative approaches to addressing threats. Maybe those are defensive approaches. Maybe those are relying on partners. Maybe, it can be a range of things, but we should be looking at kind of a range of different options before we get to using force. And I think that means that we have to make sure that we have all voices at the table. And we have all voices at the table thinking through the different ways that we can address it. And we're not kind of driving a kind of a military run process. Certainly partnerships play a big role. I think we, though, have been too quick to just say, oh, let's rely on our partners, right? Because oftentimes we've worked with partners who have a pretty dubious track record, or who we had an okay track record, but they are suddenly engaged in activities that we would rather than not engage in. And so if we're going to rely on partners, we absolutely have to own those partnerships and treat their actions as if they were our own. And then finally is I think it's absolutely essential that we address the legal framework here. It's just, crazy that at this point, almost 20 years in, we're still relying on the same AUMF. If there's a need for a continued AUMF, and I believe that there probably is a need for it, and I'd rather have a very tightly scoped AUMF than kind of an expansive use of Article 2 authorities as a matter of domestic law for conducting strikes. That should be very dramatically constrained to specific groups, regions. It should have a sunset clause. It should limit the amount of force that can be utilized. I mean, people smarter than me on these issues have written extensively on this, but we know what the solution set looks like on AUMF reform, and we just need to actually drive toward doing that.
Rachel, can I just jump in, just pick up a little bit on one thing that I think Luke said that I think was really important, because Luke, you talked about, the ways in which the US has historically claimed the ability to use exceptionally, right? And I think that's right. I think one of the things that is part of the post 9/11 era is that what was truly one-off, in the post World War II era, and not acknowledged because everyone thought it was unlawful, right, is now being claimed as programmatic. And I just want to bring out and sort of a US interpretation of its legal obligations as well as its legal abilities. I bet you if President Biden were to face, well, I won't bet anything right now, it's too early in the administration. We still have a lot of hope. But if other governments were to claim the kinds of expansive authority that the US might be claiming with respect to the ability to carry out exceptional strikes post-withdrawal, I'd be very surprised. The idea that we might say we're able to do it, but not be able to object if Russia, which has already started relying on our legal justifications for its extraterritorial strikes, or China with its government violating rights left, right, and center, or even the Iranian government, seems a bit less likely, but who knows? We've been working towards, the US government has been working towards justification that I worry deeply will turn into a more reified assertion that will harm international peace and security more than it has ever done. And I would go back again to one of the things that you sort of said earlier that made me think about this. What we're talking about is what started as a tactic, and it has turned into a strategy and a goal. And that just makes very little sense, especially if you're thinking about how many levers of institutions, both the military, but also the CIA, which essentially turned into a paramilitary lethal force organization. These are deeply problematic, destabilizing things that we should be reining in, not continuing to expand.
Thanks, Hannah. And I'm conscious of the time, and there are quite a few questions about export policy, which I'm happy for any of you to jump in, but I'm also happy to quickly take them as a leap to sort of where I want our last bucket of questions to go in the last 5 minutes, and give you an opportunity, if you don't like that question, to answer, to provide sort of your closing thoughts. But there's questions about proliferation of the technology itself, and the and again, I'm mushing a couple together, but the expansion, the export of the policies and regulations as well behind it. We do have a box in the report that's both, actually it's two boxes. One is the proliferation of lethal drone technology, and one is the proliferation of lethal drone use. Right. And so we're seeing just in the last 10 years, just in the last 7 years since we first started producing these reports, that a growing number of countries and non-state actors, we haven't even talked about really non-state actor use or other government use in today's discussion. But in 2010, there were 60 countries with active and developed drone programs of their own. In March 2020, there were 102 countries that had developed drone programs. So we're seeing countries think about acquiring this technology on a greater and greater basis because of the flexibility it affords them. In the very first report we did on this in 2014, we talked about the attributes of utilizing sort of this impersonal airstrike, and countries are embracing this dramatically. We also had questions about, do you think President Biden will continue to expand U.S. exports of lethal drones? Do I think that, why didn't we include in the report whether the Biden administration should reverse the Trump administration's policy of unilaterally interpreting the missile technology control regime to allow exports more easily of the most lethal drone systems? Partly because we didn't want to, we had an end date to the report. We didn't want to preempt what the administration was doing. I will tell you now that we know, I'm very disappointed that the Biden administration has basically said we're not going to review or redo the Trump administration's drone export policy. We are not going to change our position on the unilateral interpretation of the MTCR. And I do think the United States is looking to export this technology more readily and rapidly than it has in the past, which I think is problematic in its own right. We have not talked about this technology getting in the hands of non-state actors. Obviously, we've been talking about very sophisticated command and control systems where you're collecting information, you're loitering, and you're targeting your strikes. I say this quite frequently at events that we do on this topic. It's really a physics lesson. If you're not interested in getting that system back and are just interested in causing harm, you don't need the sophisticated system of satellites and command and control. You just need it to get to its destination and drop its payload or crash into the target. And so there's a whole range of other issues that we did not talk about necessarily in this report, but that are very real as we're talking about both the proliferation of the technology itself, the use of the technology, but also in this general frame of lethal force. So the last sort of bucket that we have, I'm going to give you 3 minutes, so a minute each, is really this international precedent that the United States is setting. And Hannah, you related to it earlier, that would we accept the Russians' justification for the actions that we have, and we may think that we're acting responsibly, ethically, morally, legally, but that doesn't mean the trust us works for everyone. So perhaps I'll start with Naz and go then Luke, and then Hina, you'll have the last word.
Thanks. I'll try to be really brief. First is to say, I don't think that Trust Us works for anyone. So I think it's important. I think sometimes when we have this conversation, we say, well, of course, we have all these systems, but what if the Russians do the same thing? And the point is, nobody should be doing the same thing. And that's not my opinion. That's the rules that we played a crucial role in crafting. So I think that's one is we need to, I think, recognize that that is problematic in anybody's hands. And second, to say there is a role for allies and other nations here. The way international law and the idea of kind of precedent setting works is that they have a voice. And I think that if we don't see a reversal of some of these approaches within the US and domestically, there is also increasingly, I think, concern amongst allies and other states that this rationale and this approach is incredibly dangerous and is getting out of hand. So I think it's also in line with the recommendations of the report. It's also important to remember that there are many other governments out there who are deeply concerned about this and who have a vote in international law to express that they do not think that this approach is lawful or is a sound foreign policy strategy.
Luke, your last word.
Yeah, no, it's a great question. I'm certainly not a arms control expert by any means. I mean, I guess I start with the proposition that certainly the level of US drone capability is very complex, but overall the technology is not all that complex, right? This is not a nuclear weapon. This is not a stealth aircraft. And I don't say that to minimize the importance of kind of getting our hands around this. I say it to say that, you know, we can be as smart as possible about limiting our exports and things like that. And, you know, countries, non-state actors, they're eventually going to figure out a way to put some sort of ordinance on a flying aircraft, an unmanned aircraft, and be able to utilize that for various purposes. And so I don't minimize, again, the arms control question, because I think there's some really key questions there, and certainly want to constrain the flow of some of the more advanced US capabilities, and certainly some of the advanced kind of intelligence sensors and things like that are things that should be very, very carefully controlled. But I think what it really points to is a deepening and not just deepening, but like a real commitment to the dialogue around the norms for the use of force against non-state actors. And that was, I think, a piece that we tried to work on with the PPG, and certainly parts of the PPG have echoes of international human rights law in them. It certainly doesn't commit to international human rights law, but there are some themes there that come up. There are themes that it raises that our European partners thought were important and guide their own operations. And so it attempts to kind of begin to reinforce some of those norms, but certainly a ton more work needs to be done in that regard. And then there actually needs to be some work into actually training some partners on how to utilize this, right? So when we look at some of the campaigns we've seen from our partners, whether it's the Saudis' broader campaign in Yemen, or even the more specific actions that the UAE and others have taken, there's a lot of potential disregard for, not potential, I mean known disregard for international law, but also I think there's a lot of kind of limited competence in actually being able to operate in a more discriminate and precise manner. Again, I think there's an element there of we can set norms, but we have to be able to train our partners to be able to actually implement them as well. And we have to be smart about what partners are working with in the first place.
Great, thanks. And Hina, last word to you.
I got to start with where Luke just left off. I think that especially with partners who are so massively engaged in rights violations like Saudi and the UAE and Yemen, training to the wrong set of standards does not seem to be the answer, right? Like the starting point should be, what does the law, which binds Saudi and the UAE, and people are in a lot of trouble if they continue to flout things even more. That's where we should be starting with. And I think that goes back to what you were talking about and started us with here in terms of the precedent. Rachel, you are second to none. You have done amazing work in the proliferation context. And one of the things I really value about you is that you take into account what this means for an international legal regime, right? Arms trade within the international peace and security framework. I'm not an expert. I shouldn't be dabbling in any of this. I watch in awe, but I think that's one of the things that you do really well. One of the things we've often talked about over the years is that important as the issue with respect to drones is, it's also that the rules that apply in the broader context are the same for a helicopter gunship or a poison-tipped umbrella, right? And that's why the ways in which the US goes forward and what the regime looks like for regulation of the use of lethal force and whether we're going to abide by international law or not, I think it's a really, again, important moment for our times, right? And I say this with a sense of urgency because 2024, not sanguine about who comes after. The final thing I will say is we're talking about, a policy and a program that has certain other root institutional consequences. And so I think among the things that we need to consider and really do is grapple with, in my view, eliminate the legal and policy infrastructure and architecture that enabled a program of extrajudicial killings in multiple parts of the world in violation of the law, international law. And that requires structural war powers reform. As we've talked about before, it requires AUMF consideration, repeal the 2002 AUMF. There's no reason or basis for it. Similarly for the 2001. And if there's going to be a responsible debate, which I hope that there is, it should be with constraints, because what we've seen at this point is executive branch claims to power run amok, and that is dangerous, I think, for everyone. But we're still at a moment of opportunity. Got to end with that.
Yes, and that's the purpose of this report, right? Is we have an opportunity to develop this new agenda and a new approach. And I do apologize for going 2 minutes over, but I do think we could have this conversation for days and hours. And I'm in awe of all of you and your knowledge and the wealth of experience and expertise that you bring to this topic and the work that you do. So thank you for your continued commitment. I would be remiss to not thank Shannon Dick, who put her heart and soul into this report over the last year, and to the Open Society Foundations for allowing us the space to create this report and the resources to do so. So thank you. And to all of our audience who stuck with us for the hour and a half, I'm eternally grateful. And to the members of the expert group and the case study authors, really, we are better because of all of you, and we learn from you every day. So I hope this report makes some contribution to the outreach and advocacy and policy work that you are all doing. I think there were numerous questions we didn't get to, but I know that all of our panelists and the experts involved in this study are always willing to have conversations and really push the envelope and think about new ways to address these complex issues. So thank you all for joining us. Thank you again to Naz, Hina, and Luke for joining us today. And we will see you again here soon, I am sure. We've been doing this for 7 years and our work is certainly not